Shalom. Hi, everyone. The Israeli-Iranian conflict raises the question, will Israel be left alone? I'm honored to be joined by a great panel. Hello to Dr. Dalia, Dassa, Kaye, Director, Center of Middle East Public Policy, the RAND Corporation, and Ambassador Dennis Ross, Counselor, and William Davidson, Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and a long veteran of the Middle East peace process. Major General retired Nitzan Alon, Vice President and Chairman at Thematic Defense. And not so long ago, the man who was dealing with the Iran issue at the IDF. And Major General Reserve Amos Gilead, Executive Director, Institute for Policy and Strategy at the IDC Herzliya. Shalom, everyone. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
You know, in a few weeks, there will be another election campaign in the United States. It will be tense, it will be crucial, it will be hysteric, it will be violent, and it will have major effects. We will deal with one aspect of regarding this election campaign, which is Iran. Trump has questioned the benefits of U.S. military intervention in the Middle East and pulled out of the nuclear deal reached with Iran, but Trump has sent more troops to the region after the withdrawal because it will increase tension. Biden, who was Obama #2, has said he will deal with Iran through diplomacy and re-enter an agreement, but only if Iran first return to compliance with the deal restrictions on its nuclear program. Biden wants the U.S. to support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, which Trump has defended, and Trump thinks he will do a deal in 30 days after he'll be reelected. So they both have issues on Iran regarding this campaign, and I think the first question is, what will happen if one of them will be elected, one of them will be elected? Do you see a real shift in United States policy if Biden will be back at the White House as president? Will he return to the Iran deal? Let's start with Dennis Ross, who has close ties and understanding of Washington inside the Beltway.
All right, look, thank you. Nice to be with all of you. Look, I would say that if Biden is elected, there will be changes. There'll be changes in style, there'll be changes in substance. The style will be a style that will be one characterized by the United States not going it alone. It'll be characterized by, I think, first coming to a common set of understandings, at least with the British, the French, and the Germans when it comes to dealing with the Iranians. Maximum economic pressure, which is what the Trump administration did, succeeded in putting enormous amounts of economic pressure on Iran, but tended to isolate the United States more than it tended to isolate the Iranians. One example of that being the British and the French and the Germans were not even prepared to support the Trump administration in extending the conventional arms embargo that was part of UN Security Council Resolution 2231 that basically enshrined the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. So the first area of change will be coordinating closely with the allies to create common positions. Secondly, as you said, there is a declared position of being prepared to go back into the deal, but not immediately. What we're going to see if Biden is elected is that the Iranians will come after the inauguration and say to the administration, you owe us. We don't get her back into the JCPOA until you give us sanctions relief. We need sanctions relief up front. The new administration will say, look, you have to be in compliance with the JCPOA. And it's not, by the way, only that you're not respecting the limits on how much can be enriched, how much can be stored, what's the level of enrichment. It's also that you have installed 2 cascades of advanced centrifuges. And those advanced centrifuges you installed 4 years before you were entitled to do so under the agreement, which means your know-how is at a very different level than it would have been according to the agreement. So what we're going to see is a negotiation that will follow the discussions, I think, with the Europeans first, maybe some of the Russians and Chinese, but the alignment with our allies will be the first priority. You'll end up getting back into a negotiation because the Biden administration will emphasize diplomacy, but don't expect there to be an immediate agreement because the Iranians are going to come pressuring to get sanctions relief. The new administration will focus on getting compliance with the limitations that were built into the JCPOA, and the Iranians themselves, because they're going to have an election coming up, how free and easy they will be capable they will be to negotiate a quick agreement is something we'll see. No doubt the internal pressures will be quite real, but I still suspect that those who expect will immediately see a resumption and an agreement between the two sides. I suspect they're in for a surprise, and it will be that we won't see an immediate agreement, which isn't to say that there won't be diplomacy. There will be direct diplomacy again. That'll be one other big difference.
Yeah, Dalia, maybe if Trump will be reelected, he said he will have an agreement with the Iranian in 30 days. So maybe he will do the trick he did with North Korea. Maybe the way to diplomacy with Iran is going with the re-election of Trump.
Yes. Well, the president says a lot of things that don't always transpire. So I wouldn't hold my breath for a New Deal 30 days after election. I think, as Dennis said, whether it's Biden or Trump, although I should remind everyone that there still is the JCPOA exists. So there is a deal, and that deal, presumably, if it survives until election, and if Biden becomes president, it could muddle along. And though I do agree with Dennis, it may take a while to renegotiate new terms. I think if President Trump is reelected and we see a continuation of current policy and nothing to suggest otherwise, there have been many junctures where the administration could have reconsidered maximum pressure, which has not yielded results, and they have not. I think what we could be facing, as much as we might want to ignore the Iranian issue, we have other distractions. I don't think the Iranians are likely to lie low. I think the way they're likely to look at things is they want to reclaim leverage in any potential deal. And the way they might see it is that actually to get to the nuclear deal in the Obama administration, they pursued capabilities that got very close to nuclearizing their weapons, nuclear capabilities. So I think we could see actually a ramping up of Iranian activity both on the nuclear front and on the regional front. As we saw in the past year when they lashed out in the Gulf, and that led ultimately to the Soleimani incident. So I would probably speculate that there would be more likelihood of an escalation than a New Deal immediately.
Thank you, Dalia. Maybe we'll ask the generals among us, the one that's dealing with the military. Let's start with you, General Alon. Do you think that the mysterious explosion in Iran can solve the nuclear problem? You know, we're waiting, they're dealing with their cascades, and then we can see an explosion in Natanz, an explosion in Iraq, and maybe this kind of military behavior by few forces in the region, maybe this is the formula to stop Iran from having nuclear weapons.
Well, there were a lot of news and rumors regarding explosion in Iran in the last couple of months. But I think that, first of all, not all of them are real, not all of them regarding some nuclear capabilities or military capabilities at all. Actually, the explosion in Natanz was probably really caused some damage to nuclear facility, R&D facility, and manufacturing facility of centrifuges. And probably they suffered severe damage in this event. But of course, that this is probably just one part of some clandestine operation, which itself should be part of some more enhanced framework of countering Iran ambitions. So in itself, it won't won't solve the problem. Don't wait to some clandestine action to solve the Iranian nuclear problem.
Okay, when we look at this explosion, Major General Amos Gilead, last but not least, we look at the explosion, we look at the maximum pressure policy, which has a lot of sanctions, but let's speak about the strategic goal. The strategic goal is to have an agreement, but a better one. What are the defense, what do you think the clauses or the parts in the JCPOA that we can and we might and we should fix if we have another deal with Iran?
There are two tracks, the nuclear and the regional. As I see it, even Trump is ready to sign agreement about nuclear, and he will not touch the regional threat in Hezbollah, Syria, Iraq. We are threatened. It's increasing. Allegedly, we are operationally, we are attacking it. Whether it's true or untrue, it seems to me as a great operational success, but not strategic one. What is the difference? The Iranians keep continuing to build their capabilities and surround Israel from all sides and to build the missiles. Unfortunately, I do think that if Trump gets elected, he will be ready to sign historic, the best agreement in the history of the world that will not include all kinds of threats besides the nuclear. And that will be very sad, if I use the terminology of President Trump, because the Iranian threat will increase, the American troops will diminish, and since 18th of October, Russia and China are entitled to sell modern weapons to Iran. And it will destabilize the balance in the Middle East. And more important than everything, Iran is obliged to their ideology, religious ideology, that preaching to exterminate Israel. And they will not drop it, in spite of the economic difficulties and so on. So if there are explosions, operationally, they are good, like the retirement of General Soleimani. But that's not the strategic solution.
Yeah, I want to pick up on your things and go back to Ambassador Dennis Ross. You know, in your last book, you spoke about policies and politicians and about how we're dealing in the Middle East as a whole. And I would like to ask you, you know, the assumption when the Obama administration dealt with Iran diplomatically was that let's close the nuclear issue, and that might help them to act more nicely in the region. We can now say for sure that that was a huge mistake. What lesson can we learn from that huge mistake?
Well, I think there are a couple of lessons that need to be learned. One, there were some of us at the time who were saying if the assumption of this agreement is that Iran is going to behave better in the region in the near term, it's an illusion, because the supreme leader is going to have to demonstrate that he hasn't given up his ideology by doing the deal, so he will become more active, not less active, which is, of course, what happened. I think the bigger lesson here is not looking at whether the ideology in Iran is going to go away. It's not going to go away, as Amos said. The bigger issue is any deal with the Iranians that's only limited to the nuclear one sustainable if, in fact, you don't have at least some understandings on the region? And my point here is that if Iran continues to operate in the region the way it does, and I agree with Dalia, the impulse on the Iranian part, especially in the aftermath of a Trump re-election, will be to try to raise the pressure, because the expectation is that's what will drive Trump to pull all forces out of the region. The point here is that you need to understand there is a relationship between what is done on the nuclear file and what is done in the region, because even if you get a deal but you don't do anything in the region, sooner or later we'll have to react to what the Iranians are doing in the region. And that will force a new set of sanctions, and the Iranians will cry foul. So no nuclear deal is sustainable that doesn't at least have some element of lessening the dangers within the region. Now, is there a grand deal that's possible? No. But there's a big difference between having a nuclear deal on the one hand, and at the same time, let's say having a deal that produces a set of red lines that are understandable. For example, that the Iranians won't continue with the precision-guided project in terms of putting precision-guided capabilities on the rockets and missiles they provide to Hezbollah and others. That there won't be advanced surface-to-air missiles that go in. If you create certain understandings that limit the kinds of weapons that the Iranians can be emplacing outside of Iran, especially in Syria or Lebanon, then that reduces the risk of conflict. It's not going to erase it. Because again, if you think you're going to get a grand deal with the Iranians where they're going to change who they are, that's also an illusion. But you can get a deal that reduces the risk of conflict, reduces the risk of escalation, and basically does deflect and delay, I think, what will be the prospect of Iran ever having a nuclear weapon. I don't believe the Iranians will ever sign up to a deal that makes it impossible for them to have nuclear weapons. I do believe they can sign up to a deal that defers it even farther down the road than what we see now. But in return for that, they're going to ask for a lot, especially economically.
So do you, as Dalia, think that we are on a path for escalation? And what do you think are the means or the ways that we can avoid this path?
We should pay attention to what we call this, which is part of the regional front, like the LRFP, long-range precise fire, that capabilities that Iran achieve, and which not threaten only the Israel and some other country in the region, but it also have some major influence on the American capability to, and the American framework, conceptual framework of the American power projection in the Middle East. I think that those Iranian conventional, advanced conventional capabilities threaten the ability of the American military to be in the Middle East, to be in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia, or even to use his aircraft carrier in the Gulf area. So this is something that both Israel and the U.S. should pay attention. It looks like some operational issue, but it has some real strategic one.
Dalia, I want to ask you, do you think that the full pressure policy with the military option, as was described, is still putting alive the option of regime change? Can we still speak about this dream of a regime change in Iran that will change the whole game?
Look, I think we have to be realistic about a few things. One, I think it's clear, and the panelists, I think, are in somewhat agreement on this, that military, covert operations, sabotage, etc., does not work strategically in dealing with the Iranian nuclear problem. It's not hypothetical. We've seen attacks in, Ofer in Iraq in 1981. We now know that Saddam actually reconstituted his nuclear weapons program. It was only an army of arms inspectors ultimately in the 1990s that got rid of the program. We know from Stuxnet, despite a very successful attack against Iranian centrifuges that significantly set back the program, Iran was able to reconstitute its program and get back to a position of leverage where it was dangerously close to weaponizing its program, possibly a month away, that ultimately led to the pressure of a nuclear agreement. So I think we need to be realistic that those options can, buy some time but not solve the problem. So then we get to, and I think that also answers the question of regime change. I don't think that people talk in Washington anymore about regime change. The new word of the day is regime collapse. The idea is that, Iran is so vulnerable, which it is domestically, facing protest, facing economic pressures and so forth. But as Amos said, it has strategic global allies, China in particular. It has workarounds. This regime is far more resilient than many give it credit for. So for better or worse, I think the reality is we are dealing right now with the Islamic Republic of Iran, And we're going to have to come to some diplomatic way to deal with this. So the last reality I will introduce is that I think, this notion that we can solve the nuclear and the regional at the same time is probably too ambitious. Of course, we want to contain Iran's malign regional activities. But look what we've seen. The last 4 years, really good data from reliable reports has shown that, in fact, with the Trump administration's pressure, maximum pressure, with pulling out of the deal, Iran has increased its support for non-state militia forces across the region by 50%. The pressure on Iran is not leading to a more pliable Iranian government ready to come to the table. It's leading to a ramping up of its nuclear program, not sprinting to a bomb, but certainly dangerous nuclear activities, dangerous regional activities, and continued support for its proxies. So I think we're going to have to be smarter about this. There's natural pushback in the region to Iranian exertion of influence. There are a lot of forces in the region that don't want to be influenced by Iran. You see this in Lebanon. You see this even in Iraq. It's natural sphere of influence. We need to leverage those natural places of pushback. We need to leverage our diplomacy with our international partners, especially the British, the French, and the Germans. And we need to get back to a position where we're unified in the West, where we may be able to get to some leverage to add some side agreements, especially on ballistic missiles. That's the biggest concern. But the Iranians, we need to be realistic. They need to get something for it. They didn't like the deal either. We didn't like the deal. And now in retrospect, they're finding the deal didn't give them a whole lot of economic relief. So I think we're going to have to be realistic when we hopefully get back to the bargaining table about what kind of deal is possible.
Amos, Gilead, I want to ask him, if this is, as we hear from our panelists, the military option is not a whole option, and diplomacy will work to some extent because the Iranian will always lie, because this is as they did so many times before, maybe the only path or simplistic path is full pressure policy that will make the regime collapse. Do you think this is a realistic avenue of thinking?
I think it is the only solution, but it will not happen. That's the problem. So we will continue to deal with Iran. Regionally, we will be left alone, as I see it. And we need to be able to weaken Iran because today we are not dealing with Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. We are dealing with one front. At least Lebanon and Syria have become one northern front against Israel. Hezbollah is attacking us from Lebanon, so-called Lebanon. It's Hezbollah. And the retaliation is by proxy, Iranian proxy from the Golan Heights. But the mastermind is Iran. So if you ask me what is the real solution, what is the serious solution, is collapse of the regime. It will happen? No. There is no capability to cause it. And I do think they will be more powerful militarily. And there will be, the pressure on us will be more intensive. So we need to be able to cope with them. As I have said, I think operationally, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank Nitzan Alon, that was one of the masterminds of these successful operations. Operationally, we will be very successful. Strategically, they will continue. So the future is a continuous confrontation between us and Iran, and we need to weaken and to prevent nuclear, because if they get to nuclear, they will be able to threaten us, and the Arabs will follow them, as MBS has said, and maybe he's doing something. There are some rumors or some pieces of information, so it's wider than it looks.
So to the, Amos, I want to focus on the question of this panel. Will Israel be left alone? You said yes. If it will be Biden, they will go back to diplomacy. If it will be Trump, maybe we'll do a show with the Iranian also on diplomacy, and Israel will be left alone with its own interest.
We are not left alone. We are not left alone. We do have very powerful alliance with the United States. We do have intel, defense, military cooperation. That's why the relationship with the Arab countries are so important, politically, not militarily. That's why we need to avoid provocations like annexation, all these dangerous moves. The left alone is with question mark. But I'm concerned that even Trump will be ready to sign the agreement about nuclear or maybe Biden, it will meet the needs about nuclear threat, but not the regional threats.
Okay. General Alon, militarily wise, if we are being left alone or we need to act only by ourselves, can Israel really do it alone?
Well, I think that the most important issue regarding the question, would we left alone, is the fact that Iran is not an Israeli problem. Basically, Iran threatens many of the countries in the region. Iran threatens American interest in the region, and that is more than other issues are the reason why Israel won't left alone. But from a military point of view, Israel do have the capability to act against Iran, both in some clandestine way, but also in some overt massive operation. But the price we would pay will be very high. And of course, we don't want to get in such an escalation. But again, the Israeli capabilities are not only military ones. I think that the fact that we have allies in the region, both the US as our strategic ally, but also some mutual interest with other Muslim countries in the region. The fact that we have some mutual interest with European countries is, I would suggest that we will keep to look at it as more complicated and combined solution, both militarily but also diplomatic, and take advantage of the economic pressures that can be put on Iran.
Thank you, Nitzan. Dalia, do you think that that Israel's ties with Arab countries, with the Sunni Arab front countries in the region, can help or can reestablish a framework that will help the next administration in the United States to use it in a more realistic way as it does before?
You know, I think in Israel and some other places in Washington, you often hear this term, the moderate Sunni front. I think we need to be really careful about a more nuanced understanding of the Arab world. There are a lot of course, the concern about rising Iranian influence, and this is not new. It in fact really, I think, increased significantly after the 2003 Iraq War that removed Saddam Hussein, the main Sunni bulwark against Shia Iran. But so in that sense, you do have a growing widespread regional concern among Sunni Arab states about Iranian influence. But there's a lot of differences among the Arab world. You see a lot of fissures within the Arab world. So I think we should be very careful about this idea of developing a front against Iran. A lot of these players have their own interests. Even the Emiratis, of course, this is a historic deal with Israel, is quite important for both Emirati and Israeli interest. I don't see it as a game changer, though, in terms of the Iran front. The Emiratis have a lot of their own national interest. Their priorities are, while they're concerned about Iran, among their higher priorities is the influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the region, the influence of Turkey. If anything, the Saudis are more concerned about Iranian influence. So the Emiratis are, of course, motivated by their relations with Washington. So there are a lot of other factors at play. I'm not sure that is the kind of key strategic issue. I think the international players, especially the European players, because ultimately to get Iran to play ball, they're going to have to get some significant economic relief. And they already know that the pressure they started last summer against their Arab neighbors, worked in the sense that you saw, in fact, de-escalation between the Emiratis and the Iranians over this last year, because none of these actors want to face retaliation from the Iranians. So I don't know if we should be focused so much. Of course, it's certainly a good development, but the idea that the Arab Gulf especially will be kind of a key factor in dealing with the Iranian problem, I think, is probably a bit exaggerated.
Ambassador Dennis Ross, I would like to use your huge experience in the region and to ask you, what Israel should do in order to influence the fact and not be left alone by the United States and other forces in the region.
Well, I think, look, there's a context right now. Dalia is right that there isn't such a thing as an Arab front, but there is such a thing as converging strategic interests. And this by itself is not enough to sort of deal with what the Iranians represent in terms of the threat, but it's one piece of what is a larger approach. And you fold in the Europeans, you focus on where you can get a kind of broad consensus on what should be the right approach. I think from the standpoint of Israel, Israel should realize that in a sense, it has an interest in trying to do as much as it can to coordinate both with regional parties, but also with the Europeans and with the United States. With a Biden administration, that may be easier. There's an irony here. The Trump administration basically alienated the Europeans. And Dalia pointed out correctly, you need the Europeans, I would say, not only for economic reasons, we can come back to that, but you also need them for political reasons. You want to build real pressure on the Iranians, it has to be not just economic, it also has to be political. They have to be isolated, not us. And the irony is that it's in Israel's interest for them to be politically isolated, not just economically isolated. Now, there's also circumstances in the region right now that create real pressures on the Iranians. It's not just the domestic internal pressures they may be quite aware of and want a way to relieve, but you look at their positions now in Iraq and in Lebanon, where very significant constituencies, including Shia constituencies, are increasingly frustrated by the role that Iran plays. And the Iranians can't be indifferent to that. So one of the points here is, again, think broadly about the strategy. It's not just, all right, how do we create consensus with others? It's also, how do you begin to get a kind of collective approach focusing on where we actually have leverage collectively, and how can that leverage best be used to affect Iran's behaviors? With a fundamental premise, we are not going to strategically change Iran. Not going to happen. One of the things I think that both Amos and Dalia, even though they said it differently, Iran, this regime has a capacity to sustain itself. And that capacity to sustain itself clearly exceeds what a lot of people on the outside believe. Does it mean it'll be sustained forever? Personally, I don't think so. I see a lot of similarities between the Soviet Union in 1980 and Iran today. The only ones who believe in the ideology within Iran are those who can use it to be in power. When the supreme leader goes, we're probably going to see some form of revolutionary guard be responsible for leadership. The thing to watch is what happens in terms of the security establishment. Are there any signs of fissures there? This is ultimately what happened in the Soviet Union. So the long-term survival of this regime as we know it, I think, is in question. But what does that mean in terms of how long it's around? Nobody knows. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 15 years? Is it 20 years? Nobody knows. And you can't plan on the assumption that they won't be there. You got to plan on the assumption that they will be there. But they have their own needs, and one thing we've seen, when they feel they need to make a tactical adjustment, they do it. So it's a question of how you both can orchestrate the threats against them or the price, the cost that they incur, but it's also, how you give them some incentives. When you put a regime like this completely in the corner, their reaction is to lash out. And if you look at what they did after the Trump administration ended the waivers, there were 8 countries that were given waivers to allow the Iranians to continue to sell oil. While their exports were greatly reduced, they still were able to export around 1 million to 1 million barrels a day of oil. When those waivers were revoked, that's when they began to apply their own counter pressure on the U.S. They had their own version of maximum pressure on American interests and American friends in the region. So the requirement here is to realize, A, where the leverage is, number one. B, to realize that if you completely corner the Iranians, the regime's not going to collapse with whatever those who wish it might be the case would believe, and they will lash out instead. The question is find the right balance, and it's in Israel's interest to find the right balance. In the meantime, Israel carries out what are tactical steps to reduce what is the more immediate threat that they face and to buy time. That's what Natanz represents. That's what the, mowing the grass of the war between the wars represents. It doesn't solve the strategic problem, and I think we shouldn't kid ourselves. So long as this regime is there, you're going to have a problem. But you may be able to reduce the character of that problem. And the more time you can buy as it relates to that problem, eventually you may see Iran change because, as I said, this regime has really lost its legitimacy. But it hasn't lost its ability to sustain itself through real coercion and the use of violence, and they've demonstrated that as well.
Dennis, Dalia, Alon, General Alon, Nitzan Alon, and Amos, thank you very much for joining me. I think this is sum up this panel. And thank you very much. I hope you will enjoy this broadcast.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ta-da.
Bye.